There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain.
Hey, everybody. Welcome again to the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Williams. I missed last week, and so I'm your host again. And this week, I know Mike McGrady is unable to be with us, but Nephi Cole is here, as usual. Hey, Nephi.
How you doing, Dave? I'm eating chocolate chip cookies and talking about global issues of import.
I'm good. And hey, I really appreciate you running with it last week when I wasn't able to be there. Listened to it, and it made me think I probably should not be there more often.
We agreed. No, I'm just kidding. We missed you, Dave.
I figured you probably agreed. Hey, we're going to, a couple of things I want to touch on really quick, and we're just going to dive right in. One, for everybody that's listening, obviously you've picked this up someplace. If you haven't taken the chance to subscribe to this, if this is the first time listening, or if you've listened a few times but haven't quite decided, is this something I'm going to listen to on a regular basis? You go ahead and hit subscribe wherever you pick up this podcast, wherever you're downloading it. Hit subscribe, and then go out there and leave us a rating, leave us a comment. Leave us a 5-star rating. That would be fantastic. We'd really appreciate it. It's that kind of stuff that gives us the motivation to keep going, because as Nephi will attest, we are definitely not in this for the money. We're in this for the joy of doing it, and knowing people are enjoying listening to it is something that keeps us interested in producing content. So if you do we'd really be grateful.
I was going to say, that and our giant egos. So those two things keep us moving forward.
Yeah, it does feed the ego a little bit, right? Right up until you get that 1-star review, and then the ego takes a hit.
You get Washington. I haven't forgotten about you, buddy.
That's still one of the greatest comments ever. Second thing, so we have a couple of things we want to touch on tonight. The first thing I want, and we're going to bounce around a little, not really bounce around, but we're going to touch on 2 topics. The first one I just want to run through very briefly. This podcast is coming out on May 14th. And on May 15th, 2019, there's going to be a hearing in front of the House of Representatives Committee on Natural Resources on a bill that, if you're a hunter or an angler, or you just generally appreciate the state's ability and right to manage the wildlife within the boundaries of its state, this is a bill that I think you should take a hard look at and just be aware of. The name of the bill is the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what it does. I'll just summarize it like this. So first of all, grizzly bears in the lower 48 states are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, currently listed as threatened. There was a population in the greater Yellowstone area of Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana that was proposed for delisting, but a district court in Montana put it back on the list or reinstated the rule, that had originally listed it. And that decision is being appealed to the Ninth Circuit. So in the interim, all grizzly bears in the lower 48 states are listed as threatened. In the event that some of these grizzly bears come off of the list, that the Fish and Wildlife Service can produce a rule that successfully delists grizzly bears, this bill, this Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act, would trigger. And I won't go through all of the things in it, but there are 2 things that I want you to be aware of that should give a sports person pause. If you're a hunter, this should give you pause. The first is it would prohibit any sport hunting, any hunting of any kind of grizzly bears in the lower 48 states when they are delisted. We're not talking about today. We're talking about when they are delisted. This bill would prohibit that. The other thing this bill would do is, for managing these populations upon delisting, it would create a council, a scientific committee. That committee would be made up of representatives from tribes and from various federal agencies and from scientists within the states that have grizzly bears, or at least one of the states that have grizzly bears. But it does not include any state representative. It does not include a biologist from the affected state wildlife agency. So one of the things this bill does, or the other thing it does in addition to preventing hunting, is it effectively takes away management of a species of wildlife from the states and gives it to the federal government.
Yeah, so just undoes the North American model of conservation for that species.
And it's difficult to tell for what purpose. What's the real reason for wanting to do this? I mean, obviously the Endangered Species Act steps in the place of state law, or creates supremacy to state law in the event that the state law is not consistent with federal law. The Endangered Species Act steps in, and the federal government takes over management of a threatened or endangered species until that time, as it is recovered and delisted.
Yep.
But at that time, the law says it goes back to the states for management. Yep. Right.
The resources are covered in such a way that it makes sense for the states to be running the show again and maintaining that resource and making sure that it's available in perpetuity.
Right. And that model has largely succeeded. We've done a few podcasts on the Endangered Species Act. There are problems with the Endangered Species Act. I think there are challenges with how it's implemented. But generally speaking, the model of recovering a species and returning it to state management has worked in the sense that a species that has been delisted, no species that's been delisted has ever had to be relisted because it's become threatened, or endangered again. And so in that sense, it's worked. And here we have a bill that's saying that's not enough. You can recover it to the point that the protections of the act no longer apply. But now we want to have this new act that protects it in perpetuity. And so
the desire
I just want to
prevent hunting.
Yeah, that's the underlying message in this bill. This is an anti-hunting bill. That's what this is, right? This is an anti-hunting bill. Now, there are other provisions in it too. I just want to make everybody aware of it. Now, I should also say this bill is unlikely to go anywhere. I think this is the second time Representative Grijalva, who's the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, this is the second time that he's introduced this bill. He introduced it for the first time, I think, back in 2017. This time it gets a hearing because he is the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. So he introduces this bill, he can give it a hearing. So there'll be a hearing on it on Wednesday. But I would not expect this bill to gain a lot of traction. So I wouldn't worry today about this bill being passed. My reason for bringing it up is just to show this is an example of why it's important for hunters out there to be cognizant of efforts that lawmakers around the country are taking to attack the hunting heritage in some way, right? And it becomes incumbent upon hunters to be effective advocates for their passion, for their heritage, to prevent things like this from actually coming to fruition.
Yeah, and Dave, it's
Nephi,
worth
you were
noting.
Going to say something.
No, you're great. So it's worth noting that this doesn't just occur on the federal level. And as an example, in Minnesota this year, there was an effort, and this is still ongoing as of this podcast. Within the last several weeks, the same type of thing occurred where the House of Representatives in Minnesota, which is controlled by one party, as opposed to the Senate, which is controlled by another party. Within the House, there was a bill. There was language, actually. They didn't bring a separate bill. They inserted language into the budget bill. So basically, what that means is that rather than bringing this up separately, as Grijalva has done here, they took the language for a similar type of initiative and inserted it into the state budget bill, which is, of course, a must-pass bill. And the language that was inserted in there by the House in Minnesota would have prohibited the taking of wolves in a similar manner, regardless of their status. So basically, they'd come off the list as being endangered but it would have permanently protected those animals and prevented the DNR in Minnesota from managing the population, the take of those animals within that state. And that was, of course, this is a totally different avenue. This is within states, so this isn't federal. And it came about very quickly. So, it pays to watch what's going on in your states. It pays to be involved with the politics of it. Certainly, that idea is just as impalatable as the idea that you would, preclude just like we don't think it's a good idea that you would preclude states from managing species. I would say it's not a good idea to write legislation that says the Department of Natural Resources, their game and fish, they can't manage species either. We want to protect the species. Nobody can manage the species. So.
Yeah. And so and there are examples like this all over the country. And so we've just highlighted two, and we'll do our best as, in upcoming podcasts, we'll do our best to highlight other issues that come up so that you're aware of them. We've done a few podcasts in the past where we ran through some of the things that were coming up in state legislatures. So this is just another example of, of things to be aware of as a hunter out there. And so with that, I want to move on to what we really wanted to talk about today, which there's last week, kind of a somber report, not kind of, this is a very somber report, was issued by the United Nations. And I know what some people are saying, so let's just get that out of the way now.
I'm one of them.
That you're saying.
If there's one thing I hate, it's UN reports. Like, really, guys?
Right.
Go ahead,
so
Dave.
no, but let's just get that out of the way, because I know there are people out there that are saying, oh boy, if it was produced by the UN, I can't rely on that. Or, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories out there about the United Nations and how they're trying to influence state and local policy, and way to go, Nephi, for perpetuating that through that kind of a statement. But it's a species report, right? So the UN, and the full report hasn't been published. They've published now a summary of their findings in this report, and we're going to run through this today. And you've probably seen some media on this, some press coverage on this. It got quite a bit of play when it first came out. First of all, let me note in this instance, the UN was really compiling data from scientific reports and journals from around the country. They were aggregating information that existed into a report to bring everything together so that you could, so that the general public could distill it more easily. Right. So they put together this report, and we'll talk about the details of it here in a second, but it was compiled by 145 expert authors from 50 countries and had inputs from another 310 contributing authors. All of these were scientists from around the world. And in this process, they also reviewed about 15,000 scientific and government sources from all over the world, as well as indigenous and local knowledge reports. And the conclusion here, and this was the sobering part, the conclusion here is that about 1 million animal and plant species around the globe are now threatened with extinction, some within just the next several decades. And it's something that we haven't seen in human history, an event like this in human history. And when I say 1 million species around the globe, say, okay, what does that mean in the context of overall, global species, right? And I believe what the report showed is that scientists estimate that there are probably about 8 million plant and animal species on the planet. Of those, about 5.5 million of them are insect species. Of course, we haven't accounted for 8 million species on the planet yet. That's the best estimate. The other piece of this, of the 1 million globally, bring it home locally to the United States, and the report suggests that about 1/3 of all species in the United States are threatened with extinction. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise that populations are on the decline. There have been plenty of reports over the past several years saying this. I mean, since 1970, about 60% of all wildlife is gone. Like 60%, we've had a decline of 60% of global wildlife since 1960. In Central and South America alone, it's been about a 90% decrease in wildlife since 1970. A lot of the decline are with freshwater species. Lots of that decline is freshwater species. But here, we in the United States, for example, why this shouldn't be a surprise is, well, let's think about in the U.S. how many species have gone extinct? Do we know of that have gone extinct in the U.S. since European settlement here? And it's been about 150. We hear about the decline of passenger pigeons, right? The extinction of passenger pigeons and the mass decline of bison. And we hear about all of these other species that in the late 1800s were plummeting towards extinction that we just saved at the last second and brought them back and under this now understood North American model of wildlife conservation, right? But there were a lot of species that we didn't know about then, or we didn't care about then because they weren't traditional hook and bullet species. So 150 species have gone extinct in the United States that we know of, and 500 other species we put into the category of possibly extinct because they haven't been seen in decades, sometimes 6 decades or more. And we just have been afraid to call it. We just haven't said, yep, they're gone, they're extinct. We just haven't called it yet. So this isn't something that we didn't see coming, right? That's one thing I'd point out. We've known that we've had population declines globally for quite some time. 60% since 1970, 40% in my own lifetime, in Nephi's lifetime, 40% global decline. But now we're talking about, projecting, looking into the future and saying, globally, we're expecting about 1 million species are at risk of extinction in the coming decades.
So it's interesting to look
Nephi.
at that. So, and I think it's worth talking about, Dave, because I think intuitively, what's hard for this is like a lot of people in the U.S. and I'm one of those people that would say, when we look around at our wildlife populations, especially as a hunter or fisher, I truly believe we live in the good old days. And so when you look at what's happened, a lot of times we talk about Pittman Robertson, right? We talk about the great successes that we had with turkeys or deer and antelope and elk and all those things since the 1930s. And so in terms of what we've done in this country, we've done a fantastic job on those things that we know about and that we've kind of targeted, right? I mean, that's
so you're saying we're in the good old days of the hook and bullet species, right? We're in the good old days of the species that we knew about, that we've kind of taken a note on. But there's more out there, so it's worth just noting that. So on this report, it came out. There's some neat information. There's some graphs, and when you look at the species that are most at risk, cycads, right? Well, not a lot of people are very familiar with that. They're probably it's not gonna come up on their notes. Number 2, they're talking about amphibians as being one of those that have, great, 40% of types of amphibians they consider to be at risk. And once again, I do think that it's important that, any quote unquote scientific study that you look at these things, you understand what's actually being said. You try and understand, you can't paint these things with too broad of a brush or jump into too many specifics. There's a lot of nuance and challenge to understanding. But you get cycads, amphibians, dicots. Interestingly enough, lots of conifers, coral reefs, certain types of reef-forming corals, some sharks and rays, crustaceans. Mammals come pretty far down before you start running into some different types of mammals. And so the other thing I would note is here in the U.S., I at least believe we are spoiled. We have a level of
And if you're listening to this podcast, you're included, whether or not you live in the US or not. There's a certain, if we have a phone that we're listening to this podcast on, we have our economics are such that we probably live in a place that spends more money on conservation than if you lived in a country where you're not going to have access to this technology. Because those are the countries, Dave, you mentioned Central and South America. That's where the rubber's really hitting the road on a bunch of these stuff, because you're living in environments where people, probably aren't reading this report on the internet. They aren't talking about it at a Starbucks coffee shop where they're all drinking a latte. We are becoming aware of this because our first world problems. And that's what, makes this really challenging to take care of.
Yeah. Can we, before we dive into that too deeply, can we talk some about what the root causes that the report identified? Let's go through and talk about some of the causes that the report identified as the reason why we've experienced such dramatic species decline or overall wildlife decline, and why we're projecting that many of these species are at risk of extinction.
Yeah, and I do, and if I can, Dave, I want to interject with occasionally there's another study that I pulled up that's from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. It's interesting how these studies kind of go in the same direction, but yet there's contrast in kind of the, assumptions of, causes and what's causing things. And also, while there may be a general agreement in direction. So go ahead, Dave. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think you can really throw the causes into about 5 categories is my takeaway. And I'll list them, and I don't know if these are in a particular order or not, but this is the order I'll list them in. So 1, changes in land and sea use. Right. 2, direct exploitation of organisms. And by the way, I should say, we'll come back and say what this means here in just a second. 3, climate change. 4, pollution. And 5, invasives. So really quickly, to give you an idea of what each of these are, changes in land and sea use. Right. I'd lump this into the catch-all habitat fragmentation. As far as land and sea use, we have done a lot more infrastructure on land. We have a lot more infrastructure actually in the sea, believe it or not. We have different agricultural practices around the globe, right? So it's basically saying that they were looking at a baseline 50 years ago and saying, here was what it looked like 50 years ago, and here's how the landscape has changed in that period of time due to human use. And these are all really, that's the other thing I'd mention. These are in the eyes of the UN report, these are all human caused influences on species decline, species numbers. So the second would have been direct exploitation of organisms. Here we're talking about, overfishing, overhunting, just overharvest generally, direct exploitation of these resources. I make sure I'm crystal clear in separating this out. But for some species, overharvest is poaching. I mean, there are species that are at risk of extinction due to poaching. We all know about them, particularly some of the African large mammals. Please don't confuse poaching with hunting. They are not the same thing. And that just is a pet peeve of mine. I see that sometimes where poachers are called hunters. Poachers are not hunters. Poachers are criminals. Right. Hunting is something completely different.
Well, and the problem is people lump these things because they assume that all these things, when they assume that harvest of an animal is like they put these, they're not making the distinction between managed harvest in a sustainable population that actually benefits the entirety of the whole, and what is unregulated, free for all, which is the other thing.
Correct.
And you got to understand there's a major difference.
100% agree. Yep, 100% agree. But those are all lumped into this exploitation piece, right? Climate change, I think we all know, everybody kind of knows what that is. Pollution, we're talking land quality, air quality, water quality. One of the biggest contributors to losses of freshwater species like mussels and snails, it's really pollution driven, water pollution driven. But there's also air pollution issues as well, and other land pollution. And, I'd be remiss from a water pollution standpoint if I didn't mention that we have 150 million metric tons of plastic circulating in the marine environment. That we've got 8 million metric tons added to that every year, which is, by the way, the equivalent of taking a New York City garbage truck and dumping it into the ocean every minute of every day for an entire year is how much plastic we're adding to the ocean. And that's just one example, but those are the types of examples in the pollution that are factored in. And then you have your invasives, right? One of the things about global exploration, humans moving all around the world in this interconnected planet that we all live on, is that sometimes we intentionally and sometimes we unintentionally move species from one place to another, and they move to that other place and they can outcompete some of the native species to the point of extirpation or even extinction. And we see it in this country, in the United States. We've seen it with things like Asian carp. Asian carp are causing huge problems in the upper Midwest, and there's a big challenge. What happens if they get into the Great Lakes, and what's that going to do to that fishery there? We're seeing it now with collared doves. I haven't seen a lot of studies on this, but Eurasian collared doves are everywhere, and I watch them personally. I hate anecdotal science, and I'm about to give you some, but I've watched them personally outcompete mourning doves, and I've seen places where I hunt mourning doves, where I used to be very successsul hunting mourning doves, where I will now only get collared doves. Yeah, I don't see mourning doves anymore. They're not there. Yeah. And then we have cheatgrass, and there's just in this country alone, Hawaii, one of their biggest issues are invasives. The state of Hawaii, the invasive problem there is enormous. So those are the list that the report identifies as the biggest threats to species around the globe.
Yeah. And Dave, I would tell you, like, the report out of it's hosted by the University of Queensland, but that report by the International Union for Conservation Natures lists a lot of the same things in a similar order. They looked at 9,000 species, and they came up their number one issue was overharvest. And then they listed, and I want to talk about why this is both a issue and solution, but they also talked about agricultural activity. So after overharvest, then they talked urban development was number 3, invasion and disease, which includes those invasive species, problematic native species, pollution, system modification, and then the 6th on their list is actually where climate change comes in. And then they have human disturbance, which includes things like recreation, and then transportation. And then the final thing that they listed was energy production, oil, gas, mining, and renewable energy of impacts to the 9,000 species that they looked at. And I think
it sounds to me like they just spread theirs out into more categories, and maybe the UN one condensed some of those, like, the changes in land and sea use probably encompassed several of those categories you're talking about.
I think you're probably right. And that's, part of the challenge of interpreting some of these studies that come out is you have to try and understand how people counted the beans, right? And which beans they were counting, how they counted the beans, and which bins that they put them in at the end of the day becomes very important when you try and have this conversation around a water cooler, or you just argue like Dave and I did for the first 2 hours prior to this.
I wish we'd recorded that conversation. I think it would have been hilarious.
Don't worry,
I did. Well, I know we have it. It because it was through text message, but it was we got into a pretty heated discussion over some of this stuff.
Text messages that cannot be FOIA'd. Just so we're clear.
That's true.
Neither of us works for a federal agency.
Or a state agency.
The other thing, though, that I think here, a challenge, I said this is what makes it both important that we look at this. One of these things that it noted, a big impact, it says agricultural activity. Now, one of the challenges is, like, when you see this thing, you can see it as both a challenge and as an opportunity, because I think we all agree that the impact of agriculture while, tilling a field will have an impact to a degree. There's a very important point where if you're not doing that work for agriculture, you're going to have a human population, a steady state human population. If we were all to go to hunting and fishing and foraging to try and meet the nutritional demands of a human population in lieu
we'd wipe everything out.
Everything would be gone, right?
We'd wipe it all out.
That's
But
and that's
also,
one of the challenges. You have to look at how how these things are part of the solution, not part of the problem. That's my 2 cents.
and well, to put it into, to build on that ag piece a little bit. In 1970, the global population was 3.7 billion with a B, billion people on the planet. What is it today? Pop
7?
quiz. What? More. We're closer to 8. We're at 7.6 billion people today.
Yeah. Over 7 billion.
The population's more than doubled since 1970, and we have to feed all those people, right? We have to feed all those people.
And here's the other thing you and I talked about too, is like, as we become, as not only, is the population, I mean, it's bigger for a bunch of different reasons. Also because guess what? More medicine is available to more people now. People are living, believe it or not, as much as people are, we're being told, oh, this is the worst, the planet, oh my gosh, it's so scary. People are living longer than they ever have before. So now we have these, there are more of us living on this planet than there ever have been before, and we're living longer. And
we're demanding more from our life too. I mean, remember, we're also demanding more from life.
Living.
We want, we want to have a cell phone, a computer, a car. We want to have a house with
the Your Mountain podcast.
Yeah. I mean, you want to have a phone that has the ability to subscribe to the Your Mountain podcast along with your iPad
stars.
and computer. You want it everywhere you can get it. You want to have it, right? We want all that, but we also want to be able to, we don't want to heat our homes with wood. 2 billion people on the planet are still using wood to heat their homes. We want to heat a lot of them don't have anything to heat their homes. We want to be able to heat our homes comfortably and efficiently. There are all these expectations we have as a, lack of a better word, a civilized society, right? These things, and we have to figure out, okay, how do we produce these and how do we do this in a responsible way? We can't turn our noses. We can't turn a blind eye to the fact that reports like this exist. I mean, that's one thing we can't do. We can't say we want this high quality of life and we're willing to sacrifice everything else to have it. This needs to be an eye opener for people, because even if we're living in the US where we have really pretty stringent environmental regulations, we have the air, we have the Clean Water Act, we have the Clean Air Act, we have the Endangered Species Act, we have the National Environmental Policy Act. I mean, we have all of these laws. We have Superfund sites to clean up pollution sites. We have this regulatory structure here, but a lot of the raw materials we use for the things that we rely on in our daily lives don't come from here. And that's something that I think people need to be aware of.
I love that you brought that up. And I was going to mention, like, that's one of the things, one of the traps that we can fall into when we get a report like this is it can cause so much division among, even we were about to start punching each other as we're talking about this. But because the issue is, we look at the environment that we live in today in this country, honestly, we're doing as good as anybody globally in dealing with these things in my mind. But that doesn't mean,
and we still have a way to go.
But that doesn't mean that it's that way everywhere. And so the tendency is for us, when we get a report like this, is to separate into corners and to beat each other up about it. Like I'm going to go find somebody from the transportation industry and bash them over the head, when really we're doing in our country probably as good as anybody. Does that mean we can't do better? Absolutely not. We can all find ways to do improvement. But one of the big challenges is there are places on this planet where people don't have the level of luxury that we have, where we have to figure out, okay, how do we, how do you help there? Because when we talked about, 90% reduction in species in Central and South America, we're not talking about, that's not my back, that's not Wyoming. This is a much grander scale, and it's a much bigger issue, and it's a lot more impactful in places for, we live in the Western US. We're really spoiled. We have a lot of, we have a full suite of our megafauna. We have a lot of things that people,
we have wide open spaces as far as the eye can see.
Yeah.
Right. We
don't live in Taiwan, in some place that has just this very, very dense populations and things like that. So or populations that live in a level of poverty that we can't even imagine, where they do not have power to keep medicine cold. Where they,
or how about water that's clean?
Yeah, we're talking about
potable water basics.
Yeah, we're talking about how we use it for which crop we should use our water for, whether we should put our water on watermelons or whether we should put it in a fountain in Las Vegas. And there's places where they're going, wow, wish we had clean water.
But remember, also, we're not perfect here. I mean, we sometimes think we are. I think we sometimes think we are because of statements like you said at the beginning, Nephi, that we're living in the good old days for a lot of species. Like as an elk hunter, I'm living in the good old days. There are more elk today than in any time in my lifetime or my parents' lifetime or my grandparents' lifetime. It's been generations since we've seen numbers like this, right? But that doesn't mean there are species out there that we can't see or we don't see on a regular basis that aren't struggling around the country. And there are a lot of them that are. And we need, awareness is the first step. We need to understand what's going on here, both nationally and globally. And that one of the big contributors to the cause of these wildlife declines are human activities, right? And so it's a first step is knowing that we're part of the problem. And then the second step is figuring out, what can we do to be part of the solution?
Yeah. And I agree 100%. I think that the toughest thing to do in this situation is the right thing to do. And that's because the toughest thing to do in this situation is not to run to one of the extremes and get mad at each other and throw sticks. The toughest thing to do is to, find out that Dave and I don't agree on a bunch of this stuff, but to sit at the same table and sit down and look at stats and be willing to smack each other around a little bit and then talk about these things and find pragmatic solutions. We've said it before on so many things, but the real, the way to help, make the, world a better place, for lack of a better, more flowery term, is to get all these interest groups to sit around the table together and say, okay, we're not going to agree on everything. We're not going to, migration corridors is a great place to start talking about things like this. It's like, okay, well, how can we, is there middle ground? Is there something that can be done? Okay, let's talk about it. What are the best practices that we all agree are good practices? Where can we, as good as we have it in this country, and we do have it good, how can we make it better? Because as we find those solutions, then we are able, as other people in other nations and other parts of the world that aren't as fortunate as us, as they begin to have the means to care about these things, then, we've already, we can show them, hey, look, these are some things that we've done. Here's our best practices. Here's how we mitigate. Here's how we reclimate. Here's how we, here's what we avoided. When we can share that knowledge with other people. I mean, that's how I think you really start to turn the corner. It's not by separating into opposite sides and then coming to fisticuffs.
No, but it does require both sides to recognize that we're contributing to a global issue here. And then both sides recognize that this is an issue that warrants our attention and trying to reverse. That there's, a couple of things, that there's intrinsic value to having wildlife out there, to having the suite of wildlife, right? There's intrinsic value. There might be medicinal value that we don't know about for some of this wildlife. There might be some economic or health related reasons to try and keep these things around, figure out a way to keep some of these things around. But the other one at the very fundamental level, and we've talked about it, ad nauseum on this podcast, and we'll probably continue doing it, right, is that we have a system in this country where the government holds the wildlife in trust for all of its people, in that all wildlife belongs to everybody. And the government is entrusted with managing it in a way to ensure that not only can we enjoy it, but that our kids can enjoy it and that their kids can enjoy it. It's supposed to be this resource that's there for future generations. And, if we don't do something, if we don't respond to something like this, a report like this in a way that brings both sides together to try and come up with, as you said, pragmatic solutions, then perhaps we're being derelict in our responsibility for that trust resource. And maybe that's overstating it, but I don't think it is. I think courts have recognized, scientists have recognized, and the general public has recognized, politicians have recognized that this is a resource that has value, that we want to preserve, and that we want to be there for future generations. So, seems to me that this is a good jumping off point for a much broader discussion about what can we do, both at the local individual level, at the state level, at the national level, and at the global level to address these declining wildlife populations.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure.
What are you going to do?
I'm going to make sure that I'm donating lots of money to Pittman and Robertson / wildlife agencies by buying tags. I'm just kidding. There's a lot more that can be done than that, but I think that there's. I mean, that's the great opportunity we have in our country. That's why it's to be frank, that's why it's been fun for me to work on Farm Bill, to work on a lot of these issues, to make opportunities available to develop collaborative conservation between municipalities and the urban and the suburban, because that's where we can really do something in my backyard. Yeah, I could do something in my backyard. I can be part of those thoughtful discussions.
See, I think that's great. It's why we both do what we do, right? We want to make, isn't there a song like, make the world a better place?
I don't know, Dave. Is there?
I don't know. I thought there was. Isn't it like heal the world, make it a better place? Yeah. That was like a Michael Jackson song, wasn't it?
Yes.
There you go.
Like an old.
I don't know that we
I should say
that's not
a newer Michael Jackson song, which makes it like one of the more unlistenable.
Well, yeah, the message is good. Maybe the person behind its moral compass wasn't always on point, but the message is good. I think it's applicable.
I'm just talking from a musical standpoint. I'm making no
Okay.
moral judgments.
We don't want to get into the value judgments of a person here.
No. That's
okay.
It's a different. We all. No, I got nothing good to say about that. There's no positive that can come from me making any more comments about that song.
Yeah,
no, I think
this
is really cool. And the coolest thing about reading, here's the deal. Like, I think, check it out. Forbes has got a great article on this. It's just, if you Google it, it's got lots of really neat graphs and things like that. And that other report as well. The conversation.com, it's worth being informed about this stuff. It's also worth being informed about it in such a way that, don't just, read the first thing you find on something like this and then turn into one of, a water cool expert who really doesn't know what you're talking about. Make sure that you understand like the whole scope of this issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't become us.
Don't be us. There can only be one.
Yeah. Be better than us. Go out and do, read it all,
research.
Do some good homework, research.
Be smart.
Remember I said at the beginning of this thing that this report was based on 15,000 scientific and government sources. There's plenty of stuff out there to dig into if you really want to learn more about this and about some of the issues around the globe and in this country. So there's no short of information. We'll try and put some of this information up as it becomes available on our own social media sites. So make sure if you aren't following us yet that you head out to Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, find us. We're at the handle at It's Your Mountain. Also, remember, send us emails if you got questions or ideas for topics for podcasts. Send us an email, yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. Nephi, anything else you wanted to add to this discussion? That I think we've, by the way, pulled off pretty well without Mike here, but we certainly miss what he could have added.
Yes, some sanity. He would have brought us to the middle. No, I think I seriously think that my take home would be, we've done a great job as a country of trying to tackle conservation issues when we've found them head on, through things like Pittman Robertson, through the Farm Bill, through conservation. And a lot of times, we've noted that the people who were involved, like we're not, we're the solution. And so let's all be part of the solution.
That's always a good message, is to be part of the solution, especially when we know, and nobody out there listening can say otherwise. Every single one of us is in some way part of the problem. And that's not casting blame. We just are. So because we're one of the 7.6 billion people on the planet. So why don't we, let's have a big tent conversation. There are a lot of them going on. Lots of them going on, but let's continue the conversation and come up with some solutions, right? It sounds so simple when we break it down like that, doesn't it? Let's just have some good conversation and come up with some solutions. Like nobody's thought of that already.
Hey, I'm not gonna lie. It's actually not that hard. What's hard is not to beat each other up about the solutions. Like that's hard. Like if you can, because the reality is, if we, I've always said this, there's two ways you can look at a problem. You can look at a problem, you can put it in the table in between two sets of people, and then you can punch each other over that problem and blame each other for it. Or we can all sit on the same side of the table, look at that problem and go, check that problem out. What are the solutions to that problem? I've got a solution for over here. I've got a solution for over here. And if you do it that way, man, you can get a whole lot more done than what throwing it in between you and arguing over it. You can get on the opposite side. You can get on the same side of it with each other. That's where the solutions are found. They're not going to be everybody's solution. There's compromise. There is consensus, the dirty word, but that's where real solution is found. It's not found in ideological, wing surfing. So that's my 2 cents.
So my takeaway from that is identifying the problem, not terribly difficult. Identifying solutions, a little harder, but doable. Implementing those solutions, the cause of wars around the world, and the reason why we have a two-party political system. But that's just me, right?
You're an extremist.
I'm a crazy extremist. We'll let that soak in with folks for the next week. And until then, remember that life is about experiences, so go have one.